East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We certainly welcome your phone calls. Tonight will be the State of the Union address, the first one given by the president. He did kind of give an update last year, but that is not technically a State of the Union address, so this will be his first, and he will have a lot to talk about. We'll give you a little bit of an overview on that, and then move on to some other stories and issues that you need to know about. But one of the questions I do want to ask early on is, what would you like to hear the president address on the issue of the State of the Union? And if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get into some of that as well as talk about some of the very important issues related to the releasing of this memo from the House Intelligence Committee. We haven't spent much time talking about it, but I will. Also, some of the articles we've posted today about how some of these senators are really extreme on the issue of abortion, because most Americans are convinced that after an infant or an unborn baby or a fetus, whatever word you want to use, has been in the womb for more than 20 weeks or 5 months, then they feel real uneasy about those kinds of abortions, and yet you have some that would have an abortion right up to the moment of delivery, if possible. And so we'll get into that. We also have a couple of other key issues, and in the second hour we'll be talking with Phil Cooke and his new book, The Way Back, How Christians Blew Our Credibility and How We Can Get It Back. So we've got lots of things to talk about, but let's get to the State of the Union address. We will give you some update on that tomorrow, but I'll warn you, we have a couple of guests in studio, so we won't give as full a coverage to the State of the Union address as others. But the first question that oftentimes people ask is, well, why do we have a State of the Union address anyway? Well, the quick answer is it's required by the Constitution. Article 2, I should say, Section 3, says the President shall from time to time give to Congress information on the State of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. Now, from the very beginning, that was kind of known as the annual message. The idea is that Congress would get information from the president. Of course, that would happen on a regular basis, but they did want to have maybe one time when you would actually have some kind of annual address. And so the first two presidents, George Washington and John Adams, delivered those to Congress without much fanfare. By the time you get to Thomas Jefferson, I believe that was the first time there was a written one. And really from him all the way really to the 19th century, these were just sort of handwritten summaries of the State of the Union, and also kind of set forth what eventually would be the agenda for that particular administration. But a few things changed. The first was electronic communication. First the radio, then television. And that changed the nature rather dramatically, because by the time you get to Woodrow Wilson, he then revived the practice of presenting the message to Congress in person, and it kind of became a platform for his agenda. Then, of course, you have the first radio broadcast of that message by Calvin Coolidge, the first television broadcast by Harry Truman, the first televised one at night by President Lyndon Johnson, and, of course, we are, where we are today. It has become quite a show, and some of that has changed depending on the presidents, but it also has been not only the presentation of the material, but all the things going on in the chamber. And it took a former Hollywood actor by the name of Ronald Reagan to begin to say, let's put some people in the gallery that we can point to illustrate some of our points. And so whether it was Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, or even tonight, Donald Trump, you will have individuals that will be sitting near the First Lady. And of course, everybody likes to see what the First Lady is wearing, what the Vice President's wife is wearing, those kinds of things. But also, those individuals themselves will illustrate a point. And since we're talking about immigration, I think you can understand that both the president as well as those who oppose him, which would be some of the Democratic leaders, will have various individuals there to illustrate the issue of immigration. Donald Trump, perhaps looking at some of the individuals that have defended our borders. Some of these others will have dreamers or those who are DACA recipients in the audience. And so that is kind of where this will take us. 5 key points that we hear, at least from the advance notice from the administration. The theme tonight will be building a safe, strong, and proud America. So that's the theme. And they talk about at least 5 key issues. One, seeking to reach an immigration deal with Congress. So that will be certainly part of the message. The second, about the strong economy after this first year in office. And I want to come back to that a little bit later when we get into some of the details. Number 3, the pushing of a $1 trillion infrastructure plan. And then the idea of fair and reciprocal trade. You'll hear Donald Trump say some things that I quoted yesterday in the second hour from when he spoke in Davos, Switzerland, and then rebuilding the military. And so those are going to be some issues that you can be watching for. One that I found out, which I thought was very interesting, is that many people are saying that he will also spend some time talking about criminal justice and prison reform. Now, if you've listened to our program any length of time, you know that we oftentimes talk about prison ministries. And Jim Garrity puts it this way, he said about 10% of all incarcerated individuals in the United States are in federal prisons. And he said if that were a state, that would be the largest state in the country. So to bring these kinds of programs to actually reduce recidivism, the returning back to prison, it says that there is an attempt to try to maybe provide outside service providers. And so the argument that some are making is that the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, could open up the Bureau of Prisons to outside providers. Some of that already is taking place. You have heard us talk about some of that on this program in the past. And I, again, oftentimes argue that if nothing else, we certainly need that because oftentimes the most effective programs, social programs we have in America are faith-based programs. Because by its definition, government can only really send money to a program. It can't talk about values. It can't talk about right and wrong. It certainly can't talk about spiritual values, but faith-based organizations can. And oftentimes they tend to be very successful. So that's something to notice. I don't know that it will be more than a paragraph in that, but it illustrates another dimension which we will see. And if indeed that surfaces, something we'll talk about in future programs here on Point of View. When we come back from the break, though, I want to also talk about the fact that not only do you have the opportunity to hear the president, but then, of course, you have the standard Democratic response. But we've had something very different, and that is not only do we have one, but if I've counted right, at least 5 responses, and so I'll explain that, and also talk about the curse that seems to befall any person that actually gives a response to the State of the Union address. It has not been very positive to a variety of individuals, and so we'll talk about that as well. But as we go to a break, if you'd like to join us, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think the president should address? What are some of the key issues? And if you were advising the president, or even if you were talking to individuals that maybe are speechwriters, what would you suggest that the president talk about tonight on the State of the Union address? We'll take a break and then move on to some other topics right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last 2 decades, Christian Smith has helped us understand what is in the heads and hearts of young people. He is the co-author of such books as Soul Searching, Souls in Transition, and Lost in Transition. In his books, he coined the now famous term moralistic therapeutic deism. The term came up in a discussion on my radio program with Kara Powell, about her book, Growing Young. She and her co-authors have identified a number of strategies that will attract young people to your church. The term moralistic therapeutic deism came up in the discussion because it is a good way to identify the beliefs of so many youths and young adults. It includes 5 key points. Number 1, a God exists who created and ordered the world and watches over human life on earth. Number 2, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most other religions. Number 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. Number 4, God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when God is needed to resolve a problem. And 5th and finally, good people go to heaven when they die. Well, as you can see, this viewpoint is not exactly Orthodox Christianity, and it certainly does not encompass the gospel. Instead, young people want to be moral and also believe in a God who is removed from their daily lives. An important question is whether this moralistic therapeutic deism viewpoint in the heads of young people because of bad theological teaching or poor listening. The authors of Growing Young argue that it is probably both. Sometimes pastors have not taught good theology, but we also must admit that most young people today are captive to the culture. That is why we must work harder to teach a biblical worldview to adults and youth. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Are you going to watch the State of the Union address tonight, or are you going to ignore it? A lot of people say it's pretty boring, even when you have somebody that is really articulate, a good orator, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, to use examples. It's still not very interesting to actually watch. And, of course, some of them go on and on. The record for the longest State of the Union address is Bill Clinton. That one was 9,190 words, and it took a long time. I remember that because we were waiting on another network to actually do some commentary. And by the time he was done, we said, we're done. No commentary. Matter of fact, this week I'm going to be speaking in a church Sunday morning in Little Rock, so I'm going to go in Saturday early to go to the Clinton Presidential Library. I've been to almost all of them. I've been to the Reagan one and the Nixon one. Of course, I live in Texas, so I've been to both Bushes and Johnson. I've been to, when I've been in Grand Rapids, to certainly a couple of others, whether it's Gerald Ford or even in Massachusetts with John Kennedy. So this is one of the few I have not seen, and so we'll see if it has something there about the longest State of the Union address. Let me, before we move on to some other topics, and since, again, we can give you a chance to express your opinion about what you would like to hear in the State of the Union address, and, of course, I'd love to know if you're even going to watch it, because a lot of people say they watch it only because there's nothing else to watch. Well, that used to be the case, you know, back when we had a narrow number of opportunities to watch television. You either watched the State of the Union address or you turned it off. Now there are other places to go. Of course, that's affected viewership for many years. But what is so intriguing is not only is there a State of the Union address, but there is always a response. If it's a Democratic president, it's a Republican response. In this case, it's a Republican president, so it will be a Democratic response. And that will be delivered by Congressman Joe Kennedy. But I wanted to point out that you have a variety of other responses that are starting to proliferate. For example, the Virginia State Delegate Elizabeth Guzman is giving a Spanish language response. Bernie Sanders, you remember him, he's going to give his own response. Maxine Waters, I'd heard before she was going to give a response. Well, it's on BET, Black Entertainment Television. And Donna Edwards is going to be delivering a response on behalf of Working Families Party. So those are just a few of the responses. Now, if you watch television tonight, in some places you'll get to see Joe Kennedy, but probably will not see the others, but you never know, but you'll be able to watch those. But I thought before I move on, I would just point out that there is something that seems to be almost the curse that actually falls on individuals who are giving the response to whoever might be in power. Let's go, for example, to 1989. You have the transition, of course, from Ronald Reagan to George Herbert Walker Bush. And the House Speaker, Jim Wright, gives the response. By the end of the year, he resigns in an ethics scandal. In 1996, Bob Dole gives the response and later loses the presidential election. 1998, Trent Lott gives the response. Within a few years, he resigns as Senate Majority Leader. 2002, Dick Gephardt gives the response and runs for the presidency and flames out in Iowa. Doesn't even make it past the caucus. 2004, Tom Daschle gives the response and loses his re-election bid that year. Let me pick on a few Republicans to try to make it fair. In 2009, you might remember Bobby Jindal, Louisiana governor, gives a response that everybody thought was the most stilted, difficult one to watch of them all. 2010, the next year, you have the Virginia governor, Bob McDonnell, and he actually resigned shortly thereafter, well, actually a couple of years later, on corruption charges. 2011, you have Paul Ryan, but that one wasn't exactly one of the highlights of Paul Ryan, but he at least is, of course, Speaker of the House. And then 2013, I had to mention this one, Marco Rubio. Do you remember the infamous water bottle incident? And another just a couple that say, you know, it doesn't always work out so well to give the Republican or Democratic response to whoever is in power. So that's just a little bit of a background to the State of the Union address. We'll cover some of that tomorrow, but as I said, we've got a number of guests in studio, so we won't give a lot of coverage. And I've had a number of you over the years that have listened to Point of View that say, I don't even watch it. I just wait till I hear your program to find out what were maybe two or three of the most important things, and it saved me an hour or an hour and a half of time. And, of course, even those of us that watch it, I've been out of the country, came back, did the wash. I'm going to do some of my ironing and some other things while it's taking place because these are not the most riveting affair, but they, at the same time, give us a lot of information about where the administration and where Congress will be going in the next couple of years. Let's get to an issue that I haven't talked about a great deal, but it's in the news, and it certainly is worthy of some discussion. And that is, yesterday, the House Intelligence Committee voted pretty much along party lines to release a memo. It's really more like a report, but it's about 4 pages, that was put together by Representative Nunes, who is a Republican. And it is an attempt to look at the abuses of surveillance. You might remember that Donald Trump, during the campaign, said they're wiretapping the Trump Tower. And everybody goes, oh, he's just overreacting. Well, now we're finding out maybe not so. And so this helps us understand in this particular memo, I call it a report, but they call it a memo, so we'll call it a memo from now on, that really gives kind of a top-line summary of some of the things we have mentioned. And if you've listened even to our Friday broadcast, I think Kelly Shackelford did a good job on the Friday broadcast of talking about why you would want some of this investigation, because we have all sorts of concerns about what was used to justify what's called a FISA court warrant, which allowed then an eavesdropping, if you will, of some of the conversations with Trump officials, including perhaps Donald Trump himself. Then where did the money come from that was used by some of these particular groups to produce the dossier, the so-called Russian dossier, that was justified there. And so in the midst of this, you've got a resignation of the FBI deputy director, which I'll get to in just a minute. And the memo really is an attempt to look at the investigation being done right now by the special counsel, Robert Mueller. and the possible links between Russia and the Trump team. But as some of this investigation is going through this, there are many people that are saying maybe what needs to be investigated more is what was being done by the FBI, what was being done by even the Democratic side of the campaign to surveil some of this, what was being done even under the auspices of the Obama administration. And, of course, that's led to others making charges that this is just an attempt to undermine the investigation and really to begin to criticize the FBI and the Justice Department. So in the midst of all of this, you have the FBI Deputy Director, Andrew McCabe, who either has stepped down or removed. Kind of hard to figure this out. But nevertheless, Andrew McCabe, is no longer working at the FBI. Now, we've talked in the past, if you've listened to this program a while back, that Andrew McCabe's wife, when she ran for the state Senate in Virginia, we're not talking about U.S. Senate, but a state Senate race, received nearly $700,000 in contributions from donors like Terry McAuliffe, who has, of course, been tied to Bill Clinton and especially Hillary Clinton. And this, of course, is at the same time in which Andrew McCabe, while his wife was receiving $700,000 for a run for the state Senate, was also supervising the Clinton probe. You remember the probe had to do with, of course, the server and the emails and those kinds of things. He finally recused himself, but that was like 1 week prior to the election. And, of course, now even though Andrew McCabe is stepping down, he's going to receive a pension of $1.8 million. It's good work if you can get it, I'd have to say. And this, again, is sometimes being criticized because they're saying, well, you're criticizing the FBI, you're criticizing the Justice Department. I like what Thomas Gallatin said. The fact that a vast majority of the 35,000 people employed by the FBI steadfastly abide by their motto, fidelity, bravery, integrity, it's a good bet that the majority of these FBI agents, actually, whose reputations are being sullied by the corrupt individuals, are just as frustrated, if not more so, by some of these bad apples. So in the next couple of weeks, we're going to probably learn a little bit more. But if indeed this memo is released, and of course it depends on the president, it could be released if the president does not object within 5 days. I don't think the president will object, so that means a few days from now, maybe we'll be talking about what's in this memo. And, of course, there have been people saying, well, it's classified. Well, what it does is summarize classified information. And, of course, Representative Schiff has said, well, if you're going to release your memo, I want to have a minority memo, that is a memo from the Democrats. And so we'll see where that goes. So it's an issue that's in the news. Thought we'd mention it, and we really can't say much more about it till it's released. But when it is, it could be a blockbuster. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
How do we know the Bible is the Word of God and not merely the words of men?
The Bible subjects itself to historical verification. It puts itself at risk of inquiry.
From the American Family Association, The God Who Speaks explores the evidence of the Bible's inspiration and authority through some of the world's most respected biblical scholars.
Just answered the questions that we've had on our heart recently.
Learn more at thegodwhospeaks.org.
Once upon a time, a man sat down before a microphone and began sharing stories, news stories, personal stories, God stories. Hearts and minds were set ablaze. Organizations launched to help others. Teenagers were inspired to become lawyers, even congressmen. People like you who supported Point of View Radio the past 45 years have made that possible. You've made it happen. Yet there are more stories to be told, more hearts and minds to be shaped for the sake of our future. Visit pointofview.net and help amplify this voice with a generous gift. Pointofview.net. Click Donate Now or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's get into a couple of other issues. Of course, we've talked about the State of the Union address and about this memo, but we are in the midst of an election year, and so in just a minute, I want to talk about some of the attempts I can see right now of individuals that want to take out any individual that might have done relatively well in the Republican primary. Yesterday, we spent some time in the second hour, but I know some of you don't hear the second hour. Yesterday, we talked about the Freedom from Religion Foundation suing Ben Carson. I will come back to that and just give you a brief summary of what we talked about yesterday. Now we have the fact that an individual challenging Ted Cruz in Texas has raised almost $2.5 million, much more than Ted Cruz has, most of that money from coming outside the state, in an attempt again to get rid of another individual that oftentimes is seen as an opponent to the liberal democratic progressive agenda. And then we'll also talk about the attempt to clean up the voter rolls. A case from Ohio went to the Supreme Court. Oral arguments being heard. If the court rules in favor of that, might be very important in this election because, after all, if you haven't seen these, we've talked about this before, there are 248 counties in this country where we actually have more people on the voter rolls than the total number of people of voting age in that county. It doesn't take long to realize we need to do something to clean that up because all of those individuals there, they may have moved, they may have died, they may have duplicate registrations. Just leaves too much potential for mischief. So we're going to see that there is a real attempt to take out not only Donald Trump, but to take out some of the other individuals. And yesterday we got a number of calls, people expressing their concern about this atheist group trying to take out Ben Carson, sue him over some issues. We'll get into that in just a minute. And, of course, now we have evidence that there is a lot of money being spent to take out Ted Cruz as well. But before we do so, let me just mention the article that I've posted here. It's by Guy Benson. It's entitled, Extremist Senators, This Proposed 6-Month Abortion Ban is Dangerous, Immoral, and Anti-Woman. He doesn't agree with that, but he's talking about the fact that when you go out and see attempts to try to put restrictions on abortion, the other day there was an attempt to deal with and have the Senate vote on the Pain-Capable Abortion Act, and that did not go any further because of some. He points out that oftentimes proponents will say that the restriction is extreme or any such action would be an affront to women's rights. Guy Benson said neither argument is accurate. He says we'll dismantle their points below, but here's the type of rhetoric. And he's got one Twitter post from Senator Gillibrand saying that if women made up 51% of Congress, do you think we'd still be fighting to protect a woman's right to choose? One from Senator Harris of California. The GOP is scheduled to vote on a 20-week abortion ban on Monday. Add your name. And again, they're all calling this dangerous and immoral. He said on the latter term, it's a radical view that supports the right to kill a fetus in its 6th month of development when that is profoundly immoral and unethical. Guy Benson says science teaches this, that shortly after the 20-week mark, born babies can feel pain. Premature infants born as early as 21 weeks have survived outside the womb. And he says favoring elective abortion on demand in these late stages of pregnancy is a radical position. Senator Harris' definition of immorality is creepy and warped, he says, and dangerous, hardly. But then he goes on to say virtually every nation in the world is already ahead of us on this moderate common sense reform. Here he's got a Twitter post from the majority leader of the Senate, that is Mitch McConnell, who said there are only 7 countries left that still permit elective abortion after 20 weeks, including the United States, China, and North Korea. Is that the group the United States wants to be in? Korea and North Korea and China. And again, that, of course, vote did not go anywhere. But again, what he has pointed out, that is Guy Benson, is that polling has consistently demonstrated that a large majority of Americans favor new pro-life protections, including these bars on elective late-term abortions and those kinds of things. For example, here, Katie Pavlich says, the vast majority of Americans, which include most Americans and most women, believe abortion should be illegal after 3 months of pregnancy, according to Gallup. You're an extremist and don't represent women on this issue. Josh Jordan, for example, says that 80% of the country opposes abortion in the final months of a pregnancy, but by all means keep pretending it's only men that don't want to see abortions in the final weeks of pregnancy. Then he points out another poll that found a lopsided female majority, 62% in favor of legislation under discussion. And so, again, you got an election coming up, and you're going to hear the rhetoric that says that if you even want to restrict abortion in the 7th, 8th, or 9th month, you're the extremist. And really, it's the extreme position that will not allow what most people see as sort of a common sense argument. So if you're kind of in the pro-life battle right now, let me commend to you this article. It's available on our website, pointofview.net. It's called Abortion Ban After 6 Months, ? And it provides some of the facts and the figures and the statistics. And it's just a reminder again that the individuals who are actually not allowing a vote on banning abortions or restricting abortions after 20 weeks are really the extremists. And so it gives you some facts, some figures, some quotes, some Twitter feeds, as well as some very good links to the polls in case you would like to make that case on your Facebook page. Or you can just hit the share button and put that on your Facebook page or put it on your Twitter feed and let some people read it, start a conversation. Before we take a break, let me talk about the fact that it does seem like there is a consistent and maybe even coerced attempt to go after some of those individuals who did relatively well in the Republican primary, of course, losing to Donald Trump. One of those I mentioned yesterday was Ben Carson. Dr. Ben Carson, of course, now serves as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And Dr. Carson is in a Bible study with the Attorney General, the Secretary of the Justice Department, Jeff Sessions, CIA Director Mike Pompeo, the Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, and Energy Secretary Rick Perry. Those are at least some of the notables. There's some others there as well. And so they've had this Bible study. Well, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, you remember them, right? Well, they sent out a Freedom of Information Act wanting more information. Well, they got very angry with Ben Carson and not only the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, but HUD itself, because they did not waive the fees for these Freedom of Information requests. And the requests do not have to be provided for free unless the information will significantly aid the public's knowledge on how the government operates. So where we are right now is the Freedom from Religion Foundation has sued Secretary Ben Carson and HUD simply for that reason. And I think we're going to also see some other lawsuits, because I know as well there seems to be evidence of another lawsuit coming, if it hasn't already been filed, by the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. So the first point I made yesterday in the second hour, and I know some of you don't get a chance to hear each one of the hours of the Point of View program, is we certainly need to be praying for Ben Carson. And I got to love his response. He says, I refuse to be intimidated by anti-religious groups into relinquishing my spirituality or my religious beliefs. He says, one of the principles of our nation's founding is freedom of religion. I'll stop being a Christian while in service in this country. I will not stop being a Christian while in service in this country. In fact, it is my faith that helps me serve this nation even better. So we mentioned that one yesterday. Again, Dr. Ben Carson, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Well, the one that's got everybody excited now in the Democratic Party is Ted Cruz will have to run for re-election this year. And his opponent, a man by the name of Beto O'Rourke, has actually raised more money in the last quarter than Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz raised about $1.9 million. O'Rourke has raised $2.4 million just in the final quarter alone. Now, most of that, 70% of these donations come from outside of Texas. And so there are a number of Democrats and other kind of liberal progressives that are just giddy with the fact that maybe they could knock off Ted Cruz. And so there is another situation where we're seeing just a concerted effort to not only try to take out Donald Trump, but to take out Ben Carson and to take out Ted Cruz. So we'll see how this plays itself out. But if nothing else, it is going to be very interesting because, of course, Beto O'Rourke is kind of a flamboyant individual at the outset. He is certainly backed by George Soros. He's a former punk rocker. We can go into that sometime, from El Paso. And also one of the rising stars with MoveOn.org, which, of course, is George Soros. So you have right now just seemingly a concerted attempt to not only take out Donald Trump, but to take out some of the other people that did relatively well in the Republican primary. So I'd love to get your thoughts about that as well. Ben Carson, Ted Cruz, and I'm sure the list will continue on as we begin to look at some of these other races. But I thought, if nothing else, these are stories that you won't hear about in the mainstream media. We like to talk about them here on Point of View. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1997, the Birdville Independent School District welcomed 2 students to their meetings. One student led the Pledge of Allegiance, while the other student delivered a statement of his own choosing, according to the school's policy of allowing student remarks. And that continued for years, most often in the form of an invocation, during which the board members stood respectfully quiet with bowed head while the student prayed. That was all well and good until a humanist group sued, alleging the school boards are not legislative bodies and should not be permitted to have an invocation in the same way a state legislature, city council, or county commission does. Eventually, the case arrived before the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, where a 3-judge panel upheld the practice, stating, quote, legislative prayers are recited for the benefit of legislative officers. It would be nonsensical to permit legislative prayers but bar the legislative officers for whom they are being primarily recited from participating in the prayers in any way, unquote. The fact that students undertook to lead those invocations was of minimal concern. Quote, although it is possible to imagine a school board student expression practice that offends the Establishment Clause, the court explained, this one, under its specific facts, does not, unquote. This is a routine area of challenge by secularists, but one with limited success, since the long tradition of our country is one of support for prayer at public meetings. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Tomorrow, we'll certainly get back into some other issues and certainly talk about the State of the Union address. And in the second hour today, we're going to have Phil Cooke with us as we talk about the way back. But just before we do so, I mentioned that we're in an election season. And for those of you watching online, I've got our newest booklet out called Making Your Vote Count. We make these available to those of you that support this ministry, $45 a month. We've been broadcasting for 45 years, and if you join with us in our truth team, we are certainly encourage some of you to get at the lowest level, $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year. But if you join at the $45 a month limit, an opportunity, there is a great opportunity for us to suggest to you that you can actually receive these booklets, and we've done some on Sharia law and politicized culture. This one on making your vote count reminds us that right now, as we're getting into an election, we can do a couple of things. First of all, we need to register people to vote. I've got a whole section here on the stewardship of the vote and how many people, even in the last elections, did not vote, unregistered vote. So that's one of those issues. Another one is something I mentioned just in passing, but I want to come back to, and that is we have a need to clean up the voter rolls. In 248 counties in this country, we actually have more names on the voter rolls than we have a total number of people of voting age in those counties, at least at the time of the 2016 election. So there was a case that went before the Supreme Court. It's already heard oral arguments. It's from Ohio, and they have what I think is a very common sense approach, and that is the state attempts over a 4-year period to contact voters if they have failed to vote in the last few elections. If they respond to any of the notices or vote even once during that period, they remain registered. But they're only removed if they failed to vote over 6 years and failed to respond to any mailing. Now, although that sounds really common sense, as you might imagine, there are people that have challenged that and point to the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, oftentimes known as the Motor Voter Law. If you go in to renew your license, they ask if you've been registered to vote. And it does prohibit canceling registration solely for not voting, but it also says that the state can allow you to remove names when a voter does not respond to the mailings. So my question for the critics, and really even for some of the justices on the Supreme Court, is if missing 3 consecutive election cycles and ignoring various mailings, in this case from Ohio, is not sufficient for the removal from the poll rolls, what should be the standard? So we'll see where that plays itself out, because that could be really key in some of these elections. And we're seeing right now, a lot of money being poured into the state of Texas, for example, to try to defeat Ted Cruz. And if indeed there is some funny business, is a nice way to say it, at the polls, sometimes that has allowed individuals in other states to be elected. So that's something of real concern. So let's, if nothing else, take a few of your phone calls, because some of you would like to address some of the issues I've put on the table. We'll head up to New Hampshire first. WSEW. Bob, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, I just like to point out that there's a lot of political vultures from the left that would love to eliminate the Republican Party, just like they did the Tea Party, or whatever you call it, some years ago. Uh-huh. They like to do the same thing as the Republican Party, but this is supposed to be, last time I checked, a 2-party system.
That is certainly the case, and there is a real attempt to see if they can knock off a few individuals. And the people that seem to have the target on their backs right now are Dr. Ben Carson, although, of course, he's not running for office, but trying to knock him off at the Housing and Urban Development. And, of course, Senator Ted Cruz. There's some others. But let's go back to the phones here, and we'll talk to Kay in Missouri. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, I was just thinking that there's no reason why all of us around the United States cannot. It doesn't have to just be from that part of Texas. If you're going to have this other man sort of sending money in, we could all, what is $10 or $20 from all of us Americans and add to his campaign? There's no reason why we can't.
Well, again, like I said, on the other side, 70% of the donations, interestingly enough, to Beto, with a B, Beto O'Rourke, came from outside the state of Texas. So he's getting George Soros money. He's getting money from other individuals, and I'm sure from California, New York, all sorts of places that would love to knock off Ted Cruz. So we'll see how that plays itself out. I think really what's going to end up being a Democratic money pit. They're going to spend millions and millions of dollars and have nothing to show for it. But I could be wrong, and so that's a good point. That
we're not taking a chance. Yeah. We don't need to take a chance. What's the $10 from, when you guys were having trouble and years ago, and I thought, I was listening, I said, well, I should support it. I listened to the program, so there's no reason. And I do like Ted Cruz. I think he's good, and so I could support him. And as far as Maxine Water goes, I'm going to tell you, I heard that woman.
Yes, this will be interesting. I'm going to try to watch it because it will be interesting what she says.
She called the Republican, whoever was Speaker of the House before, all demons and made fun of the whole Republican Party. And those Democrats laughed. Now, if that's not rude, I don't know what is. And I heard it. I've watched her do it, and I thought, and nobody called her down. Nobody. So I don't like this double standard.
Yes.
You want to call the Republicans down, but you let that Democrat say anything she wants, and she didn't get called down because the one in control then was a Democrat. And it was, and Nancy Pelosi should have called her down, and she did not. In fact, she laughed along with her.
Yeah, well, a lot of them are fearful of her because they know any action against her could be perceived as anti-black or or racist or whatever. So I understand some of that, but again, I sometimes laugh, but not because I agree with it, but because I just go, this. I can't even believe some of the things she says. And to watch it tonight, I'm not even sure which channel BET's on, but if not, I'm going to try to watch some of the YouTube clips or something like that, because I'm sure there will be some things that will cause all of us to roll our eyes a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, again, I just wanted to alert you on a couple of these issues, and we aren't going to spend a lot of time talking about every one of these senatorial races, every one of these congressional races, but these do make a difference. And you can imagine if we had a different Secretary of Housing and Urban Development than Ben Carson, I don't think some of the kind of attempts to address poverty in the inner city would be moving us effectively as well. If Ted Cruz were removed from the United States Senate, just think of where he stood on some of those issues. And so it has been kind of intriguing over the last couple of days to see what is starting to develop as a pattern. And I shouldn't be surprised by the pattern because, as I pointed out before, Beto O'Rourke is an individual that is kind of seen as a rising star right now because of his work with MoveOn.org and because he's been supported by George Soros. George Soros, by the way, is from Hungary, and every time I go to Hungary, and last week I was in Budapest, Hungary, teaching at Word of Life, just a reminder, and every time I go I hear more stories about George Soros and his influence not only in Hungary but in Europe and, of course, now here in the United States. And so it's something to pay attention to. Whether or not that's going to make a difference in the election, I don't know, but some of you that may have supported Ted Cruz or a Ben Carson in their primaries 2 years ago maybe might think about what you want to do to support them again. If not financially, certainly support them in prayer. We're going to take a break. There's a lot more to cover. And let me just mention again, those of you that make a contribution of $45 a month receive things like making your vote count. And we're going to be paying attention to these issues of cleaning up the voter rolls, trying to get more individuals like us that listen to this program registered to vote and then going out to vote. And so this is a booklet I really wanted to put in your hands to help you be more effective. Even has a section here on what your church can and can't do in terms of educating the congregation. The bottom line is there are all sorts of things churches can do, and sometimes pastors aren't aware of this, so getting a booklet like this, passing it on to your pastor would be another way to do so. So as you support Point of View, we want to give you information that will help you to be more effective. We come back, Phil Cooke with us. We're going to talk about his new book, The Way Back, forward by Eric Metaxas, fascinating book that will challenge you to live for Christ in a culture that sometimes is hostile to Christian values. We'll be right back.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that we have talked about the fact that we sometimes live in a post-Christian culture, a post-truth culture. We've had one in which we recognize there's been sometimes a decline in Christianity, and yet it doesn't have to be that way. And so we're going to talk about what we can do to find our way back, and that, of course, is the title of this new book. The Way Back, How Christians Blew Our Credibility and How We Get It Back. It is published by Worthy. We have information about the book on our website, pointofview.net. You can most likely probably find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we give you a place for you to order it. We also have a chance to talk with one of the co-authors, and that is Phil Cooke. We have a link to his website, Phil Cooke, cook.com, and you can find all the links there as well. Phil Cooke, if you're not familiar, has certainly been involved for many, many years, creating and producing all sorts of media programming. You may have seen some of his other books, for example, Unique, telling the story in the age of brands and social media, and a number of others. This one he has co-authored with Jonathan Bock. And Phil, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
I'm thrilled to be here. This is terrific. Love your show.
Well, and I appreciate you as well. I know many people have maybe seen some of your YouTube videos. The one that makes me laugh the most is when you were at Liberty University and things like that. So we, of course, have followed your story. And what I think is so interesting, I got to tell the story before I get into the book. The forward by Eric Metaxas. Eric Metaxas, somebody I've known for years. We both went to the same Ivy League school, and we've known each other. And he's been in studio with us, and he's been with us for a number of years. Well, he tells a story about he was in Wittenberg, Germany, which makes sense because the last time he was here, he was doing the book on Martin Luther. And at one point, Matt Crouch says, you know, you remind me a lot of Phil Cooke. It's not the first time he'd said that. And then like a minute later, they look up and there's Phil Cooke walking right by us going to a restaurant. And so they just had the best time. Now, you were there to actually film some things for the Museum of the Bible. Now, is that just the greatest museum on the planet? I mean, that's what happens when you spend $500 million, $500 million on a museum. And so I know you've been associated with them as well.
It's amazing. From day one, they brought us on board to do all the filming of construction and all the way up through the grand opening. And so I've literally had a video crew on site in Washington, D.C. every month for 3.5 years. And we had 3 crews shooting the grand opening. And I'll tell you, it's one of these things that as a Christian, it's the kind of thing that you want to take non-believing friends to because it makes you so incredibly proud. I mean, it's an amazing thing that every listener really needs to make plans and go see because it's quite remarkable.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I've said that as well. And matter of fact, I went to one of the early openings, so I didn't get to go in every facility. And frankly, you could spend days there. So I think next time I'm going to go, I'm going to give some time so that we can do it. I think they actually calculated you need to spend like 2.5 weeks. If you saw everything, it would take about 2.5 weeks. It's that huge. So, it's just
and
amazing.
By the way, the Smithsonian called it the must-see museum of the year. And when I was there filming a week before it opened, the director of the Louvre in Paris was there and was completely blown away by it. So this is a world-class museum. Secular, Christian, doesn't matter. This is a world-class museum them all the way around. So it's very exciting.
We're going to have to do a point of view tour or something like that. But
that'd be great.
If nothing else, Phil, of course, is the co-founder of Cooke Pictures, an individual that has been involved in all sorts of different ministries. And some have said that he's almost like a working producer in Hollywood with a Ph.D. in theology. But let's get to the reason why you and Jonathan wrote this book. Something went wrong, and we need to find our way back. It's like you're traveling in a foreign city, and you take a turn, and you realize, wait a minute, I'm going the wrong way on a one-way turn. I've got to do a U-turn and go back. So you're convinced that there are some things that we need to change, and a lot of that has to do with the perception our culture has of Christianity. True?
That is so true. You know, for years we've been discussing, John and I, my co-writer, have been discussing why we're losing our influence in the culture, why Christians continue to be marginalized, why our influence is waning. And, you know, at first, we're media producers, marketing guys. So at first we thought, well, it's got to be a marketing problem. You know, the answer to everything is better marketing. You have your house is too small, great. Let's call it cozy. You know, there's always a way around the marketing story. Maybe we're not branded well. But the more we got into it and we started really researching why we're losing the influence, we found it's much, much darker. And we realized the perception, the way we view ourselves as a Christian community, and the way the culture views us is radically, radically different. Probably the greatest gulf between the two perspectives at any time in history. And so that's where we really started. How do we get to that place where the culture not only just doesn't pay attention to us anymore, but actually dislikes us? They don't want to have anything to do with us. And that's really what started the trip, the journey for the book.
One of the things you talk about relates to our conversation yesterday with Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Piercy. I've been talking Pelosi all hour. Nancy Piercy yesterday was with us, and her particular presentation had to do with the fact that she wrote her latest book, Love Thy Body, by really wanting to provide a positive example. And in your book, you talk about the fact that what we see are people saying, I'm sick of Christians trying to push their agenda on me. Don't tell me who I can marry. Just leave me alone. And her focus was, we are oftentimes known for what we're against: abortion, euthanasia, homosexuality, transgenderism, the hookup culture, some of the things she talks about. But if we understand the biblical message and figure out how to portray it, Nancy Piercy gives us an understanding of using a positive message. Don't you think that's certainly one part of the answer here?
That's a huge part of it. Of what she said about being an example is so true. You know, Jesus never tried to influence people. He never tried to recruit people. He never tried to sell people. He just provided a better way. He always showed a better answer. And it's always interesting that when you look at the Gospels, whenever Jesus spoke, whenever he taught, people were astonished at his message. And we started thinking, how many people get astonished at the Christian message anymore? How many pastors preach on Sunday and the people are astonished? It just doesn't happen much. And yet that providing a better way, I think, is far better than criticism, boycotts, petition drives. You know, it's not about compromising our values or principles. It's simply about showing people, you know what, there's a better way to go about this. And that's, we discovered, makes a dramatic difference in the way people live their lives.
Like you said, it's not a marketing problem. It's kind of a sales force problem, right?
Yes. Well, what happened was we started thinking, okay, what's caused this disconnect? Because, you know, there's the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. I mean, the Bible lists the fruit of the Spirit as these are things that should be reflected in our lives. When non-believers think about Christians, they should think about the fruits of the Spirit. But we did a Man on the Street series of interviews. We went out and talked to people, and we just said, when you think of Christians, what do you think? And we got back hypocritical, judgmental, harsh, phony, insensitive. So we realized, okay, there's a big disconnect here. So we went back to look at ourselves. I mean, could it possibly be the way we live our lives? So we went to the best research we could find. We went to Pew Research, Gallup, Lifeway, Barna, and we started looking at how Christians live their lives. And we picked 4 areas. This was kind of interesting, kind of, you know, low bar areas. This is not fasting or mission trips. We picked prayer, church attendance, Bible reading, and tithing. You know, this is like not hard to do stuff. This is like baseline stuff for being a Christian. But what we found about what our behaviors are like is just absolutely horrifying. For instance, with prayer, we found that 63% of Christians say prayer is essential. Well, that sounds great until you realize that the flip side of that is 37%, more than a third of Christians, don't think it's essential. That's the problem.
We're going to take a break and come back and look at those: prayer, church attendance, Bible reading, and tithing. Got a lot more to cover in the book, The Way Back, right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last 2 decades, Christian Smith has helped us understand what is in the heads and hearts of young people. He is the co-author of such books as Soul Searching, Souls in Transition, and Lost in Transition. In his books, he coined the now famous term moralistic therapeutic deism. The term came up in a discussion on my radio program with Kara Powell about her book, Growing Young. She and her co-authors have identified a number of strategies that will attract young people to your church. The term moralistic therapeutic deism came up in the discussion because it is a good way to identify the beliefs of so many youths and young adults. It includes 5 key points. Number 1, a God exists who created and ordered the world and watches over human life on earth. Number 2, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most other religions. Number 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. Number 4, God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when God is needed to resolve a problem. And 5th and finally, good people go to heaven when they die. Well, as you can see, this viewpoint is not exactly Orthodox Christianity, and it certainly does not encompass the gospel. Instead, young people want to be moral and also believe in a God who is removed from their daily lives. An important question is whether this moralistic therapeutic deism viewpoint in the heads of young people because of bad theological teaching or poor listening. The authors of Growing Young argue that it is probably both. Sometimes pastors have not taught good theology, but we also must admit that most young people today are captive to the culture. That is why we must work harder to teach a biblical worldview to adults and youth. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have with us today Dr. Phil Cooke, and if you would like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We have information about the book, The Way Back, How Christians Blew Our Credibility and How We Can Get It Back, as well as a link to his website, philcooke.com. And let's come back to this, Phil, for a few minutes. Prayer,
sure,
church attendance, Bible reading, and tithing. I might even encourage our listeners to just number 1 to 4. And the first one you mentioned, prayer. Again, 63% of Christians, so that's a majority, say prayer is essential. But the downside of that is, as you said, 37% go, don't think it's essential. That's a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, to have more than a third of church-going Christians saying prayer is not important or essential, that's a red flag for us, a huge red flag. So then we went to church attendance. And, Kerby, you'll love this. The bar is so low now for church attendance that to be considered a regular, you only have to show up 19 times a year. That means you show up 3 out of 8 Sundays, you're now considered a regular churchgoer.
Wow.
And we found even in spite of that low bar, the Harvard Institute of Religion discovered that on a typical Sunday, only 20% of American Christians are actually showing up at a typical church. Now, that's not people who identify as Christians. That's 20% of church-going Christians. The people actually consider going to church important, but on a typical Sunday, only 20% actually show up. And with Bible reading, it gets brutal. It just gets worse. When we studied Bible reading, we discovered that 40% of church-going Christians, the people in the pews out there, 40% of them read the Bible once a month, rarely or never, which means almost half the Christians in America are rarely or never reading the Bible. So, hello, red flags just started going off like crazy. Suddenly, and let me finish with tithing. We might as well go there because that really hurts. With tithing, we discovered that less than 10% of church-going Christians are actually giving 10% of their income. So, the bottom line is we're just not paying attention to what God has called us to do, how we live our lives, which means the Christian community as a whole. Now, obviously, there are Christians out there, but I'm sure many listeners to your program who are doing all the things right. They're showing up at church. They're reading the Bible. They're praying. They're seeking God. However, we have to realize that when the vast majority of Christians aren't doing that, that paints us all with the same brush. And we start to realize that to the non-believing community, we're all talk and no action. As they say in Texas, big hat, no cattle. And so suddenly it started to hit us that all those things people say about us, being hypocrites, being phony, are exactly right, because what they see is so dramatically different than how we position ourselves or how we think we are. So, and what's really funny is, not funny, it's really sad. We have the nerve to get upset at people living the lifestyle they choose to live when we're not living the lifestyle we're supposed to be living. So that suddenly put everything in perspective for us.
One of the things I've done over the years is work with various campus ministries. Before I did this, I used to speak on college campuses a lot more than I do. But one of the things I've found, Phil, is that they've really concluded, and whether you talk to navigators or crew or Baptist Student Union or InterVarsity, whatever, lots of times they feel like evangelism on the campus is stalled. And I think part of the reason is that the non-Christian world, the non-Christian students look at the Christian students and say, you don't look any different. I mean, you just get as stressed out before a test as I do. You go out and drink just like I do. You seem to be sleeping around just like I do. So what's the difference? And I remember one of the surveys we did at Pro Ministries, we asked non-Christians, what do you perceive is the difference between Christians and non-Christians? The most common answer, Christians go to more meetings. And again, why would you be a Christian if you go to more meetings? And so
how sad.
The point you're making is that in some respects, Christians have abandoned their faith, and we're the first to notice it, or actually the last to notice it, aren't we?
You're exactly right. And boy, your example is so true on campus. I have a friend who was talking to a businessman the other day. He was sharing Christ with him, and at one point in the conversation, he asked the businessman, would you ever consider becoming a Christian? And he said, well, I've thought about it, but I have two vice presidents in my company who are Christians. They go to church every week, but they don't live any different than I do. One's cheating on his wife with a secretary. The other gets drunk every weekend, but they show up at church. They call themselves Christians. And he said, so I don't really see what's different about being a Christian. Why would I want to become one?
That's
so when we're not reflecting the life that Jesus called us to live, that doesn't make anybody interested in wanting to be like us. So that just hurts us from the get-go.
Let's talk about one of your chapters. You talk about that other God. Speak to that issue for just a minute, because that was really a key issue.
Well, we don't think of ourselves as idol makers. When our pastor goes on vacation, we don't make a golden calf in the lobby or anything. We always think those Israelites were idiots. So what were they thinking? But the truth is, I think human beings are incredible idol-making machines. Sometimes when we think of idol worship, we think in terms of worshiping money, or we have an idol of our career or something like that. But what we discovered is the reason we're not reflecting the life of Christ and the fruit of the Spirit is we've kind of modified the God we worship. He looks like the God of the Bible, but the truth is we start worshiping a God that he understands why I don't go to church. I mean, I have a busy life. I have a lot of things to do. He understands why I don't have time to pray. There's a lot of things going on in my life right now, and he understands why I don't give, because I'm saving up for that new car, and God's okay with that. Or he understands why I'm cheating on my wife, because he wants me to be happy, right? And my wife, she's getting kind of grumpy as she gets older. So we've fashioned a God out of our own worldview rather than conforming our lives to the worldview that God has called us to. And we just discovered, we almost called the book That Other God, because, and you find it talking to Christians. It's funny, when I ask Christians, what do you think about this subject or that subject? They never say, well, you know what the Bible says. They always say, well, I feel like what I feel is this or that. So we've almost negated, we're not reading the Bible, obviously, so we've almost negated what the Bible says in favor of what we think. And so that other God thinks all that stuff's okay, and he's understanding and forgiving, and it's really got us off course.
Well, again, the book is entitled The Way Back, How Christians Blew Our Credibility and How to Get It Back. It is published by Worthy. It's just a great book, and it certainly will challenge you. And a minute ago, I encouraged you maybe to number 1 to 4. We talked about prayer and church attendance, Bible reading, and tithing. Well, let's talk about the 7 areas, what you call the S7 mysteries, because another action item is, and these are all starting with S, surrender, scripture, submission, service, sacrifice, simplicity, suffering. But you talk about the fact that sometimes these are not just additive, they're multiplicative. Okay, we're going to get into higher mathematics here for just a minute, but talk about this.
Well, it's true. And the interesting thing, the reason we really discovered these areas are they're areas that were incredibly important to the early church. Those first few generations of Christians, they had no money, they had no power, they had no influence, they couldn't change the vote on anything, they couldn't even protest something or they'd get put in jail. And so we discovered, what did they focus on? And they focused on areas that we don't even hardly preach about anymore. I mean, submission. Nobody in the 21st century wants to hear about submission. I mean, come on. And sacrifice. I was thinking about sacrifice the other day. You know, we don't deny ourselves anything anymore. We don't want to do a diet. We don't want to do anything that causes us to deny ourselves. And so those were areas that we discovered that when you start exploring those, getting those into your life, they just cause your life to completely be transformed. And what happened with the early church that I find so fascinating was that, like I said, they had no power or influence, but they could live their lives differently. And so in many areas, for instance, one was the Roman Empire had no regard for life whatsoever. Sounds like our culture today, huh? Mm-hmm. They had no regard for life. So when a child was born they didn't want, or maybe it was a girl or an extra mouth to feed, they would just let it die of exposure. They would put it on the city wall or take it outside the city and just literally abandon it to the wild animals or to starve. That was so common in the Roman Empire that we have existing letters from soldiers in the field back home to their wives saying, look, when the baby's born, if it's a girl, just let it die of exposure. And so the Christians, they felt like children are born in the image of God. We've got to do something about that, but they couldn't protest. They couldn't pass a law. So what they would do is they would go out under cover of night, and they would take in these infants off the city wall or out of the fields, and they would bring them into their family and raise them as their own. And other believers in the community would contribute money to help with the cost. The Romans could not wrap their head around why anybody would do that. I mean, it was just baffling. They were astonished at why anybody would think that highly of a human being that they would want to do it. And there were other areas. When the plague hit, Christians would make a beeline to the heart of the plague while the Romans couldn't get out of town fast enough. And even a Roman emperor wrote a letter saying, Romans are cowards, but these Christians, they risk their own lives to help other people. Well, historians now tell us that so many of these issues happened that the Romans were forced to confront and rethink who these people are and who is this God they talk about all the time. And historians today tell us a major shift happened in the Roman Empire just because of the behavior of Christians, because it forced that culture to rethink who these people are. Why do they do this? And who is this God that drives them and motivates them? And part of the book, a big thrust of the book is, what are the things that we could do today? I mean, we've seen that politics, that doesn't work so well. Getting involved in politics, boycotting, that doesn't work so well. Petition drives, what I call anger strategies, that nobody changes their life because you yell at them. So we wondered, what are the things we could do today that would so astonish the culture, it would force them to rethink who we are as Christians and who is this God we serve. And that's a significant portion of the book.
Well, again, we're going to come back and even use an example that Nancy Piercy used, and you do as well, the Dropbox and some others, but we need to take a break.
Yeah.
We are going to come back and give you a chance to join the conversation. The way back, how Christians blew our credibility and how to get it back. We'll be back right after this.
How do we know the Bible is the Word of God and not merely the words of men?
The Bible subjects itself to historical verification. It puts itself at risk of inquiry.
From the American Family Association, The God Who Speaks explores the evidence of the Bible's inspiration and authority through some of the world's most respected biblical scholars.
Just answer the questions that we've had on our heart recently.
Learn more at thegodwhospeaks.org.
Once upon a time, a man sat down before a microphone and began sharing stories, news stories, personal stories, God stories. Hearts and minds were set ablaze. Organizations launched to help others. Teenagers were inspired to become lawyers, even congressmen. People like you who supported Point of View Radio the past 45 years have made that possible. You've made it happen. Yet there are more stories to be told, more hearts and minds to be shaped for the sake of our future. Visit pointofview.net and help amplify this voice with a generous gift. Pointofview.net. Click Donate Now or call 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us today and continuing our conversation with Phil Cooke as we talk about his book, The Way Back. And one of the things that you were talking about in terms of the Roman Empire certainly relates back to conversations we've had over the years with Rodney Stark. I know you know him because you quote him on 4 different occasions, or at least have 4 different references in your For Further Reading, because, again, it is a testimony, I think, to early Christianity that it outthought the culture and outloved the culture, and it caused people to say, who are these people who call themselves Christians?
Yeah, it's funny. The early Christians, that first generation of Christians, not only were nobodies and had no authority or impact or influence, they had no plan. I mean, remember when Jesus ascended to heaven and the disciples were just kind of standing there staring off into space, God had to send an angel down and say, okay, guys, let's get moving. Let's get with it here. And so all they could do is really live their lives in a different way than everybody else was. And I think that's something so important to remember today, that if people don't notice, I ask people a lot of times, how many of your neighbors actually know you're a Christian? How many of your coworkers actually know you're a Christian? I'm stunned at the number of people that say, well, you know what, my coworkers really don't. We've never talked about it, or I don't live any differently than them. And if that doesn't, I mean, why would anybody consider salvation if they don't at first start thinking, you know what, I like the way that guy lives. I like he's living in victory. He's living a triumphant life, even in the face of difficulties. He's still victorious. If we don't live that kind of life, nobody's going to want to become like us.
So, again, we have to live the life. We also have to speak it. You know, Phil, never had anybody come down my street and say, you know, I've seen this kind of Shekinah glory over this house, and I wondered what kind of man lives in this home, and please tell me how I can achieve salvation. So even living the life, as important as it is, we need to give some verbal assent. And like you said, some of these people have never, ever crossed the line of saying, you know, I'm a Christian, because one of your chapters is stop thinking everyone hates us. We just assume that nobody cares, nobody really likes us. We might as well just try to hide like the first century Christians, and we've missed a real opportunity, haven't we?
We have, and the truth is, I tell you, I discovered that when you're really sharing the fruit of the Spirit, when you live, you exhibit joy and love and patience and kindness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control, you don't have to witness. People notice, and they start asking you. It's funny how often people will come up to me and say, man, I talk in the book, being on a flight at 6 in the morning, because I'm a morning person, and I was sitting next to a lady that struggled with her seat belt, and I reached over and helped her with it, and she said, thank you so much, but whoa, why are you so happy this morning? It's 6 in the morning. Nobody should be happy. Well, it just opened the door for me to share where that comes from. So I agree with you. You don't have to force your way into conversations. If you exhibit the life God's called us to live, people will start wondering why, and they'll ask questions.
Again, the book is published by Worthy, and I would certainly commend to you the book. And I mentioned just a minute ago the For Further Reading, which goes on for pages, 250 pages. And the first section we sort of talked about, where did we go wrong? Second section, when the dawn is dark. Now let's get into the third section, the purge. And this is important because you talk about cleaning out the fridge. I also talked about stop thinking everyone hates us, stop pretending we're in charge. There's an attitude adjustment. Can you speak to what that might look like?
Well, you know, the truth is, I don't ever say this was a Christian country, but the truth is, for 200 years, Christianity has been the dominant faith in America. There's no question about it. And people who would never darken the door of a church believe that there was a God, or at least they thought it was a good way to live. My dad was a pastor in the 50s and 60s in Charlotte, North Carolina, and people who had never darkened the door of a church still respected my father. And I read a poll just last week that indicate now pastors are trusted at lower levels than used car salesmen.
Amazing.
That's no offense to car salesmen listening to the broadcast today, but it's just shifted dramatically. And so I think when you see, and you in my lifetime, you know, Kerby, that when we were kids, praying in school was perfectly normal, especially during exam week. Abortion was wrong.
Yes.
Marriage is between a man and a woman, unquestionably. But in our lifetime, that has been completely turned on its head. And so it's happened quickly. So obviously, A big part of the problem is we get upset, we get angry, we get frustrated, and I completely understand that. But the truth is we can't let that drive our response. We just can't. I mean, the early church, they not only faced that, they faced much worse, and they faced persecution. But they didn't let anger strategies. I was sitting in the office of a television network executive in Hollywood just last year, and I happened to bring up Christianity. And he said, oh, I know Christians. They're the angry people. The only way he knew Christians was if he produces a show they don't like, they flood his switchboard with angry calls. And he said that was his whole perception of Christians, the angry people. So unless we change the way people perceive us, we're really not going to get very far in changing their acceptance of Christianity or wanting to become like us.
One of the things I've done every once in a while, Phil, is interview somebody that turns out to have been a Navy SEAL, and you use this great example of what it's like. Now, not that I want to put anybody in the Christian world through what's called Hell Week, but you do ask a fundamental question. What if we took Christianity as seriously as Navy SEALs took their training? And you just mentioned a few minutes ago when it comes to prayer and when it comes to tithing and when it comes to Bible reading and other kinds of things, we're just very lackadaisical. But what if we really were very serious about that? That would, I think, instantaneously turn the whole perception that people have of Christianity around, don't you think?
So true. Commitment, I think, is the key word. Commitment. Navy SEALs are committed to the job. They're committed to the task, and they will do whatever it takes. My co-writer, John Bock, and I actually produced a video series with Navy SEALs, and I was just stunned at how committed those guys are.
Yes.
But you look at the typical Christian. The minute it gets difficult, the minute it gets challenging, they start to bail. And I think just seeing people tend to be fascinated by people who are extraordinarily committed. And I'll tell you, radical Islamists, they're committed. Scientologists, they're committed. All these other fringe groups are committed. If we don't exhibit those signs of being committed, nobody's going to be interested in anything to do with Christianity.
Talk about what you might say to Christian leaders. First of all, you've got a lot of Christian leaders that are quoted in the book, including my own pastor, Jack Graham, and others. But we have a number of listeners to a point of view that are pastors, Bible study fellowship leaders, sometimes even seminary students I've met. What would you say to them? Because in some respects we have to lead by example, but perhaps it also makes we need to maybe make a change in how we preach and teach and encourage and exhort. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, it's interesting, Kerby. I work for a living. My job is helping Christians use media more effectively. So I work with people like your pastor, Jack Graham, who I adore. I think is a brilliant, brilliant man and a great leader. And I work with men and women like that across the country who have media ministries of various kinds, helping them reach a larger audience. As a result, I get to work with hundreds of pastors. And one of the things I'm seeing out there is that people really do have a hunger for more. This idea of pastor as motivational speaker is pretty much over. Mm-hmm. People are looking for something really serious. I'm seeing churches. I know a pastor at a church that meets in a high school in Hollywood, has 3,000 20-year-olds at his church, and he preaches for an hour and a half. Who would have thought that would have been possible a few years ago? People are hungry for more. So I say this is a perfect time in our community to get serious, get much more serious about teaching the Bible, get much more serious about a sense of holiness. Holiness is almost a bad word now. We don't think about that much anymore. But the truth is, holiness really fascinates people. They want to understand how that works. So I would encourage pastors that this is the time to go deep. I think people are looking for more than a rock star experience or a mall experience or something they get in the world. They're looking for something significantly deeper. So if there was ever a time to really start preaching biblical principles in a serious way, this is the moment.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a few very specific examples in the makeover. Apartment life is one. I mentioned the Dropbox and a few others that certainly are key. So if some of you want to say, well, what exactly does that look like? We've got a couple of very helpful examples for you to maybe follow and think about. And then let me also, for just a minute, encourage you to go to the website, philcooke.com. He's got all sorts of great material. The one that's posted today is how to host a great panel discussion, but every day you're going to find something helpful there as well. Things about creativity, leadership, influence, media, culture, and Hollywood. You've got opportunities to maybe even have him come and speak, and I think by now you would certainly say, I would love to have him come and address this book or some of these other issues. There's a store, there's a variety of other things that you can find, and it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. We also, of course, have information about the book. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, it's available both in paperback and in Kindle. We're giving you that opportunity as well, and of course have posted a couple of articles related to the conversation we're having today, and even some of the things we'll be talking about tomorrow, as we have had a chance to hear the State of the Union address. Let's take a break, though, and when we come back, we'll talk about a few examples, and these are just examples, but certainly indicative of how you can take some of these ideas about living the Christian life in a way that causes other people to look at you and ask you what is different about you. Maybe some things that you can do as an individual, or as certainly you can do as a church. We'll come back and talk about those right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1997, the Birdville Independent School District welcomed 2 students to their meetings. One student led the Pledge of Allegiance, while the other student delivered a statement of his own choosing, according to the school's policy of allowing student remarks. And that continued for years, most often in the form of an invocation during which the board members stood respectfully quiet with bowed head while the student prayed. That was all well and good until a humanist group sued, alleging the school boards are not legislative bodies and should not be permitted to have an invocation in the same way a state legislature, city council, or county commission does. Eventually, the case arrived before the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, where a 3-judge panel upheld the practice, stating, quote, legislative prayers are recited for the benefit of legislative officers. It would be nonsensical to permit legislative prayers but bar the legislative officers for whom they are being primarily recited from participating in the prayers in any way, unquote. The fact that students undertook to lead those invocations was of minimal concern. Quote, although it is possible to imagine a school board student expression practice that offends the Establishment Clause, the court explained, this one, under its specific facts, does not, unquote. This is a routine area of challenge by secularists, but one with limited success, since the long tradition of our country is one of support for prayer at public meetings. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and we're privileged to have with us today Phil Cooke. The book is entitled The Way Back. He is the co-author, and lots of stories in there, but I thought I'd mention one that was actually in Nancy Pearcey's book, but we didn't mention it yesterday. But I remember years ago when Brian Ivy came into the studio and talked about this new film called The Dropbox. And what a great illustration of sort of a 20th century, almost 21st century example of what we saw in the first century, because as you well know, there is a tendency today, as there was in the Roman Empire, for children to be left outside or to have unwanted newborns just allowed to die. And this was just a very creative way to save babies and to really be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ.
So true. You know, as we went back and looked at the early church, if they turned the world upside down simply by doing things that astonish their culture, a big part of our book is what are the things we could do today that would so astonish our culture it would force them to rethink who we are and what this Christian thing is all about. And so we offer 6 or 8 examples, and I just love the Dropbox because Brian did a documentary film on it that was so accepted, so well done. The Hollywood Reporter, you know, the Bible of the entertainment industry, had a glowing review of the film, and it was shown in Hollywood. It was shown all over the country. And it's such a great example of this doctor in South Korea that because of cultural things, when children are born out of wedlock or they're born deformed or with horrible physical limitations, they're often just abandoned on the street. And so this doctor built what he called a drop box, literally like a mailbox in the wall the size of a child that had heat and everything in it. And women could come in at night and deposit their child. You've heard it because you've interviewed him on the show. They would deposit their child, and he decided to go and do an interview on this doctor that would take in these unwanted children and raise them. And it was such an example of the kind of thing that it's generated worldwide publicity, and people all over the world, you know, raging pagans talk about how great this is. And that's the kind of thing. It's a great example of the kind of thing we could be doing today that would just astonish the culture.
Well, talk about some that we could be doing today. I mentioned another one before we went to the break, and that is a ministry I'm very familiar with, Apartment Life. Now, this, some people say, well, I can't do the Dropbox because that's not a big issue in my community, but find me a place where we broadcast and the 300 radio stations we're on that don't have apartments nearby. What a great opportunity for ministry. Yeah, in Apartment Life, they just decided, let's go to an apartment complex and talk the owner, the landlord, into giving us an apartment for a young couple or two men or 2 women, and let them kind of be chaplains. Now, they don't witness, they don't hold church service. They just want to be like social directors and be there to help people move and be there in a crisis and have people help them. What they discovered is it's so successful that people are willing to stay in that apartment complex for years longer. They're willing to extend their lease because of this couple is in this apartment that helps them, and they're able to charge more for being there. So secular business leaders who own these big apartment complexes are thrilled to have this Christian couple living there free of charge, because this Christian couple, for all practical purposes, becomes kind of a chaplain to everybody in this apartment complex. And what an incredible way. I think the statistics were staggering at the number of apartments, like you say, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It's just amazing. And so it's turned into this just remarkable ministry that even non-believers respect and look at and say that's powerful. But in the book, and again, you know, our examples were just examples. We want people to think of their own ways that they could astonish the culture. But a little way we did was what we call a Craigslist Christmas. My co-writer, John Bock, about 10 years ago, the week before Christmas, put an ad in Craigslist in Los Angeles and said, look, if you're struggling to make Christmas happen for your kids, let me know. I'd like to help. And 3 women responded, single moms. They responded. He and his wife, Kelly, met them at Target and went through with 3 grocery carts and filled up toys, clothes, pajamas, and then at the end of the night gave them all a $100 gift card for food. And it turned out to be an amazing experience for those single moms who had an incredible Christmas because of it. Then the next year, John called me and my wife, Kathleen. The next year, we called a few more people. This past Christmas, now 10 years later, we had 15 people from the entertainment industry show up, and we had 15 families. Some are single dads, some single moms, some's a grandmom having to raise her grandkids.
And we took them all through and helped them have the greatest Christmas of their lives. And we pray with them. They want to know why we're doing this. In fact, it's so funny. After 10 years, the Target employees now know that something's up. They're asking us what's going on. And so that's something anybody could do, just to take a needy family through. And so often we farm out our acts of service. You know, we write a check to church or a ministry outreach we like or the Salvation Army or whatever. And that's okay. I encourage that. However, I think there's a role for us to play, because when we minister to people like that, it not just changes them, it changes us.
Certainly
and so
does.
there's little ways. I have an evangelist friend in the UK, J. John, who says, you want to be a missionary? Awesome. Go next door. You know, how many of us have ever thought we could just make an impact on our street? If we could start changing our block and our street or our office, it could have a huge impact.
Speaking of that, I might also recommend the YouTube interview where J. John interviews you, because that's kind of a fun one to watch as well.
Oh, yeah, that was terrific.
And again, like there are the Craigslist Christmas and the apartment life and Dropbox and so many more. But just before we run out of time, one of the things, Phil, I've done is provided a link to your website. And so if people wanted to know more about you, get some of the great material that you write, or maybe they'd like to schedule you to come and speak to their church or their conference, tell us what they will find when they go to philcooke.com.
Well, I write about the intersection of faith, media, and culture. You know, we live in as you know, Kerby, we live in a media-driven world. And I believe with all my heart that if churches and ministries and individual Christians don't learn to use media more effectively, we will simply lose this generation. And so my passion is helping people. You know, just an individual housewife in Omaha can have an amazing ministry through social media. And so I think there's so many ways that churches or nonprofit organizations or Christian ministries can use media to reach the country and reach the world with the gospel. So I'm all about showing people how to do it more effectively. You can find articles about how to use social media to share your faith, how churches can be more effective in the way they communicate their message. And my passion really is to how to embrace media in this culture we live in to share the gospel more effectively.
Well, again, creating influence that inspires change. On the upper right-hand corner, there's also a way you can sign up for the newsletter. I would highly recommend it, because he's dealing with creativity and leadership and influence in media, culture, Hollywood, and I think you'll benefit certainly by going to his website. No doubt you'll benefit with his 250-page book published by Worthy, The Way Back, How Christians Blew Our Credibility and How to Get It Back. And you and John, I appreciate the work that you've done in the book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's been fantastic. Really appreciate it.
Again, Phil Cooke, the book is one that I would recommend. Those of you in positions of leadership, think about maybe teaching through it, preaching through it. This could certainly be a small group discussion. You could break it into the 4 categories we've talked about, or you could go to each one of the 18 chapters. You could figure out how you'd like to use that. So let me, again, encourage you to find out a little bit more. All of it available at our website, pointofview.net. As you go to the website, of course, you'll find some of the other articles I've posted. Tonight, we will watch the State of the Union address. We'll talk about it briefly tomorrow. We'll also have some guests in studio that will talk about this new film, Samson, coming out. Also got a Christian artist that will be here talking about music. So we will not focus all of our time and attention on the State of the Union address, but we will give it its due. And so we hope that you will join us tomorrow for our discussion with, of course, Nick Pitts and our Millennial Roundtable. But it'll be a little bit different because of all the other things transpiring tomorrow. So I hope that you will join us. And, of course, throughout the rest of the week, we'll be looking at some issues in the news. And, of course, Friday is our weekend edition. So all of it taking place at the website, pointofview.net. We have some of the videos for you to watch, so let me encourage you to watch those videos, as well as my Viewpoints commentary today on moral deists. All of it available to you, and we certainly want to put those resources in your hands so you can be more effective. I want to thank those on the other side of the glass, Andrew and Steve, for their help behind the scenes. We'll take a break. See you back here tomorrow after we watch the State of the Union address tonight. We'll see you then.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, What are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives.